Welcome to Cyber Threat Thursday. I'm Kristin Judge, the CEO and founder of the amazing team and nonprofit called the Cybercrime Support Network. We are really more than a company, we are a team, and that's why I put it that way. So thank you for joining us again. Today, I have my dear friend and colleague, Jim Emerson, here with us. Jim wears so many hats and is really, when you're talking about cybercrime and law enforcement, people just say, call Jim. And so I'm really excited to have him here. Jim, would you please introduce yourself for a little bit here and tell us, everybody, about some of the things that you do? Otherwise, we'll be here for 3 hours.
Well, Kristin, thank you. You're very kind in your comments opening, and I'll try to be the good partner that you've represented me to be. I am a vice president at National White Collar Crime Center, or NW3C, as many people know it. And we are an organization that have been around for over 40 years, 43 to be exact. The mission of the center is training and technical assistance, largely to state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement agencies, but increasingly we're training federal officers as well as international agencies in the same disciplines. We also deal with prosecutors, judges, regulators, so the audience is a little more diverse than just law enforcement and criminal justice. And to be very precise about the domains, typically you can think of us in three ways: economic crime, digital forensics, and cybercrime as investigation goes. And we take a very broad interest as relates to proficiency and capacity in all of those different areas. And Kristin, sorry, I also chair a committee for IACP, the Computer Crime and Digital Evidence Committee. So again, I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to have this conversation with you.
And I think that's where we met. So, and for people who don't know, IACP is the International Association of Chiefs of Police.
Yes.
And I think we met at one of those calls, and so, or those meetings. And today our topic is managing third-party cyber risk. And again, we could talk about 17 different things together, but today I really want to focus on this. There's been a lot in the news about third-party cyber risk. We don't even have to name the companies, but it's a big issue right now. And for you and I and others who've been in this space, it's been a big issue for a long time, but until there's a really big hack, unfortunately, people don't always pay that much attention to it. But let's take advantage of people being concerned right now and get some education out to them. And I want to make sure that we mention too, before we go too much farther, that NW3C was one of the very first partners to sign on at CSN as a partner. I think it was back in 2018. We were just getting started because your team saw the value in what we were doing. So thank you for being one of our very first partners. All right, let's move on. The movement to cloud hosting and outsourced IT services. This can be really sticky for some people. The solutions are off-premises, but that's a growing trend now for public safety and government. Is that okay? Is it okay to go to the cloud? Is this a third-party risk? I know these are some of the conversations I've been having. What do you think about that?
Well, first, I guess it's probably appropriate to say that IACP and the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police partnered in 2013 to look at the issue of cybersecurity across technology for law enforcement agencies or their entire enterprise. And that was refreshed in 2019. And one of the dramatic things that comes from that 5-year snapshot is essentially the migration into the cloud and SaaS-related services, microservices, and unfortunately, given the nature and demographics of law enforcement, public safety in the United States, we have a lot of smaller agencies by percentage that are out there dealing with the issue as they can take bites of it. So you end up with a quilt-like reality.
That's a good way to put it.
and that adds complexity in many cases to the discussion. The marketplace, I think, if you were to go to a trade show now, you'd find that most of the offerings are cloud-based offerings. And to be fair, depending on the environment, you end up in many cases with a better security hygiene by going to the cloud than you would have maybe traditionally on premises, with all the factors that go into that, such as resources, pedigree, the actual technology capacity and credentials that you have in your own staff. And when 73% of agencies are 25 or less sworn officers, we really don't have a right to expect them to have that pedigree.
And we both know workforce development, cyber, is a huge issue. So I've been working with county government for a long time, and when they were thinking, okay, now we have to hire security people too. Well, we don't have money for a new FTE. Where do we find a security person when we aren't able to pay what Facebook and Google can pay? And so the cloud really became the go-to because of those issues, as you're saying, right?
It's true. I think that there was hesitancy because we tend to have a lot of control issues in the sense that we want to see our data, we want to know that it's safe, we want to be able to actually direct it in a micro sense. The problem is it's too expensive, it's way too complicated, and so this is a solution that is intuitive on a lot of levels with cautionary note. So
let's talk about the cautionary note. Upsides and downsides for public safety and third-party solutions.
There is, I think, first and foremost, a tendency to be relieved when a certain technology equation moves off premises, and I think that's in a sense something that is a bit of a misnomer, because to be fair, the responsibility doesn't go with the contract to the vendor.
That's right. That's right.
And it's important for executives to understand that, their staffs to understand that. And then when you do encounter that reality, then there's the question of, well, what do I do about it? And how do I deal with the fact that I have actually delegated control for the functions in a place that I think is going to do it better than I can at a cheaper price point? How do I actually look over their shoulder and ensure that it's being done the way that I would do it personally on premises?
And for governments too, I know in working with counties and even states, you have to find out where is your data going to be stored. There's only some countries that they're allowed to store the data, because remember, cloud doesn't mean it's in the cloud. It's actually a server in someone's backyard. But what country is that server living in? And that's an issue that public safety has to deal with. Am I right?
That's true. And to be fair, the criminal justice information system security standards, as brokered by the FBI for many years, have been a bit of an impediment in the early cloud years for moving out there. And so until those hosted environments were truly CJIS compliant and could essentially address those standards functionally and reliably all the time, 365, then there was a bit of a ramp, shall we say, to getting there. And I think even the federal agencies took a while to move large repositories of data on premises into cloud solutions. But that was really kind of the foremost issue for caution and hesitancy. As that wave has started to break ashore, where more and more of that data moves into the hands of third parties, the phenomenon we encounter then is much like the bank. Robbers go there because that's where the money is. So now when we think about malicious technology attacks, regardless of what their form is, the reason they tend to look for vulnerabilities in those third-party environments is simply because that's where the data is. That's where these services are emanating from.
So that's why the third parties are becoming a more attractive target, because if you want to just hit one federal agency, that's fine and dandy. But if you go through SolarWinds, you get to all of them or many of them. Why wouldn't you go that route if you're thinking from a criminal intent or in a disruptive, enemy state, basically, right? So that's why the third party is an attractive target right now.
It is, and SolarWinds, that particular attack, if examined in depth, is very technical, and based on how it's been studied by the security professionals that have looked deep into that particular threat, it likely took hundreds to thousands of hours to actually perfect that attack across a wide scale supply chain like process that we've seen roll out here under SolarWinds. I think that we shouldn't forget the other end of the scale. The other end of the scale is that when we go to a vendor, the vendor has created a community of customers. and it's a neighborhood, a logical neighborhood, albeit.
Yeah.
And so you really have to stop and think about, what neighborhood am I moving into, and what else do I encounter in that neighborhood, and how do I contribute to the value of the neighborhood, or maybe detract from the value of the neighborhood, as a simple analogy. So when we start to aggregate data in a place with a particular commercial entity, a vendor, or we rely on a specific supply chain, we start to share logical concerns.
I like that analogy because it's almost like the neighborhood watch, and you're only as safe in a neighborhood as the, least safe person, in a sense, if they're letting down their guard and causing issues. So we have to make sure that everyone that goes into that cloud service has security in place and is making sure that they're being diligent about it.
It's true, and it's really a two-way phenomenon. In some cases, it could be, depending on how the vendor guards their relationship logically with each of their clients, what they do to insist upon certain security hygiene in that binary, that back and forth, that serial is probably a better term, relationship between the two. You've got to consider the fact that that's not only an issue for you, that's an issue for all of their customers. And frankly, once they are facing a problem of some sort, then the question is, how much segmentation really exists between my particular interest inside of that environment and any other customer's interest in that environment, much like, the flood compartments of a ship. If something happens on one side, starboard bow, to a particular vessel, water's coming in, is it going to affect me on the other end directly, or is it just something that I've got to be somewhat concerned about?
Now, you brought up one issue about the misconceptions of risk management, where some people think, oh, this amazing cloud provider has all my data now, I don't have to worry, it's their problem. But in reality, if you ask people or you gather the data, you are responsible for it from A to Z, no matter where it lies. It's your data, even though you're using someone else to manage it. Are there other misconceptions about risk management when you transfer these functions to a third party?
Well, I think one of the misconceptions is, depending on the particular nature, the operating system environment in a cloud hosting facility, your data being virtual, you need to understand what that means as relates to the data set. Does your data in fact move within that environment? To what extent does that create certain kinds of risk for your data, and as it exists in the hands of that particular third party? Now, the second thing I think that is worthy of concern here is that many vendors don't do everything. They're not a la carte. So you've got to think about who subcontract to them and what that means to their particular risk profile. So from the perspective of I, as the data owner, what I've done is I've extended the things that would normally keep me awake at night on premises to worrying about a number of people performing them. And while I don't have to do it, and I don't have to pay the raw cost of doing it myself, I may be getting a bargain because I'm someone in a crowd of customers. I do need to think about how risk actually propagates across that crowd.
So it really brings us to the issue of due diligence, that whenever somebody talks to me about cloud, I start with, okay, before you pick a cloud provider, there are some really great lists online that say, here's the checklist. So what due diligence? So number one, you just brought up, okay, they may be your cloud service provider A, but they may use B and C companies to do stuff with your data. Do you even know that it's touching B and C company also? So what does due diligence look like when someone's picking a third-party service?
Well, I would start the answer by saying that National Institute of Standards and Technology, as they focus on the federal government, have created cybersecurity frameworks, risk management frameworks, even third-party risk management framework application across vendors and supply chain issues. There's a series of documents that are directly relevant, and I would encourage anybody, whether they're a federal government entity or not, to go look at them, because they provide very sound and thorough guidance as relates to this topic. But to simplify that, to kind of boil it down, if it's my data in your hands, I really have to think about your hygiene. And to me, that exists on a couple different levels. Do you, as the vendor, have a risk management program that I can actually understand and evaluate, assess.
Yes.
And then further, do you as the vendor or a contiguous part of a supply chain have an assessment mechanism that assures that your maturity model, that you're constantly looking at cybersecurity issues across your own landscape, your entire landscape, to include your own house? There are many examples of where a company has gone and spent great amounts of money to harden, what they've done for their customer base, and then left some isolated web page, unattended to, and it provided a small window for someone to crawl in through and get inside and do great damage. So I think that from a hygiene perspective, when somebody thinks about creating a contractual relationship with any third party or an agreement of some sort to share data with any third party, it becomes very, very important, in my view, to test the vendor's hygiene. And it may feel intrusive, it may feel impolite. To be fair, I think it's absolutely necessary.
And that's why you've got to have a lawyer make sure from the very beginning, a cybersecurity lawyer, look at your contract before you do anything, because you want to make sure that you're going to be able to go in there and look under the hood, not just when you sign the contract, but maybe 5 months later, maybe 10 months later, so that you can continue to monitor them. You can't just assume, okay, they checked off the box on this checklist, now I don't have to worry about the security, right?
I think you're right, and I think that also goes to two other kind of subsets of that discussion: data propagation. How will your data be copied? How will it move? Who will have access to it? I mean, those are not trivial issues. And if we look at the Blue Leaks data breach, I mean, there was a tremendous amount of public safety data in a single place, and to be fair, there was maybe data retention was an issue that should be examined more closely in the aftermath of that. How much data do we want a third party to retain at any given time? Where does it land? Just because it's not the current data set, is it any less important? I think we found that in breach scenarios, it's not a lot less important. It's still quite damaging, for the most part. And then frankly, breach related issues, is the vendor or any of the subcontractors to the vendor somebody that we should know about historically? Have they had an issue? What have they done about it? How has that been fixed, mitigated, fully? And so that circles us right back to risk management, because now we want to go back and see how they really fed any of those kinds of historical footnotes into their risk management program, and how that results in patches or additional effort in their continuous monitoring or any of their cybersecurity efforts, their control base, were they effective, have they adjusted them, etc. That sounds like we're managing our own organization when I talk that way.
Yeah.
But I think frankly you have to find a way to do that with third parties in this day and age of cloud everything. Oh.
You do. So you probably need someone on your team, depending on the size of your organization, clearly, or the size of your government agency. You need someone that really understands this, that's in-house. I don't know if that's, if you've got a lot of third-party contracts and relationships with your data, with your security and other things now, you really have to have someone who's got an eye on that. And I think the chief information security officer could probably have someone who's focused on just third-party risk. I haven't seen that, and you may not have either. I just thought about this. Have you seen a third-party risk person or that as a job potentially?
I think in the private sector, it's becoming increasingly more common. Typically, regulated sectors tend to take those kinds of initiatives to maturity much more quickly. Finance is obviously led discussions in the cybersecurity realm because of compliance issues that they've faced for many years. But there is a third-party risk there's a series of certifications that are out there now, so that if you wanted to hire somebody that had a depth and an expertise in third-party risk management, there's actually programmatic education and certification to accompany that particular need.
Okay, that's what I was wondering about that. It just seems like, and I hadn't even had looked into that. There's so many incredible careers you can go into that touch cybersecurity, and it's exciting to know that there's something for everybody, I think. Let's talk about, as security incidents seem inevitable in the IT service provider landscape, obviously, we hear about them almost every day. What should relationships with third parties ensure to address this concern?
I think, to be fair, the organization, obviously, you would expect them to have a plan, and to be able to share the details and the nature of how they expect to respond to any incident along the continuum of potential. I mean, what they do day to day as they see malicious activities, maybe just at the edge, be deflected. How do they use that data? What do they do with it? I mean, because that actually speaks to how they think about the process of any kind of an incident, how they're going to respond to it, and how much forward leaning they might be with regard to incident response. I once listened to a professional presentation, and the individual who was speaking said, "You need to behave like you're hacked now." And
Right.
Intuitively at the time, it didn't make immediate sense to me. And what he was trying to convey was that if you don't act that way, if you don't operate that way, that you won't have the requisite sense of urgency in finding and preventing anything, or at least mitigating something that has started to occur at a much lesser point of damage. And so, from the standpoint of a vendor, I don't think it's any different than you or I would treat our own organizations. I'll be very, very candid. As soon as some of the events of 2020 started to unfold, we accelerated some of our security testing at NW3C because we were concerned that we would want to lean forward, get ahead, make sure that we understood something that might not be slated for another couple of months. Let's do it now. Let's push it up and get it done. And I think that, if you're dealing with a third party that doesn't have that ethos, that tells you something immediately about what to expect if an incident does occur. It's going to kind of be very lockstep and slated into a process that maybe is just business driven and not necessarily responsive in a way that you would want it to be. And that leaves me with just one other comment about that, Kristin, and that is, I have listened to people for years complain about the fact that contracts never seem to be flexible in the face of great change in the cybersecurity space. We lock ourselves into a relationship, that is legal and fiscal, and there's a service level agreement. But when things start to morph or maybe accelerate in ways we couldn't have anticipated, many times those contractual vehicles don't account for that. And it leaves the data owner at a disadvantage. So I would suggest that at the front end of any engagement, thinking about the middle or the back end is really important. So.
Yeah, having contingencies and being flexible. I agree with you because I did procurement for state and local governments in cybersecurity when I was at the MSISAC, and none of the procurement rules were written in the country for cyber issues. I worked with one state CISO who she couldn't get mobile device management for her state employees for 2 years because that was the budget cycle. And I don't think they've ever gotten a fix on this, but we do have to think differently when it comes to cybersecurity. And I'm hoping that, the bigger these hacks get and the more it's out in the news, that I think CEOs and boards are now starting to understand a little bit better than when I got into this area 12 years ago, was trying to convince people that cybersecurity was something you should pay attention to. I'm sure you had friends who thought you were crazy too and didn't understand what that was. But, now I think you have the ear of the people that need to pay attention. Can we change the dynamics of contracting and legal? I think we really need to focus on that because you're right. The laws and the contracts are not necessarily written in a way that we can react and protect our country, our national security, our companies, our economy. All those things are at stake here. So we do have to build in some flexibility. I want to ask you a little bit about, can you ask a third-party provider to be a part of an exercise with you? For example, I'm thinking about if they hold your data, you have ransomware, you want to do an exercise that says, okay, if we did get held for ransom here and our data was, encrypted and we can't get to it, will you go through with us what it takes to bring our data back? Can you ask that of a third-party provider to be a part of an exercise?
Kristin, given the amount of cryptographic attack surface that we have seen, in the last, 5 or so years, half decade, I would think that it would have to be almost demanded in an effective contract vehicle that you're going to not only have them sit with you and talk through the issues that your risk management program suggests are key issues, things that you can't afford to have happen, but also maybe precursor events and the things that lead up to those types of losses or incidents that have effect. And so, I think it's absolutely necessary. I also think that it's not unreasonable to essentially contract with a service provider to share information with you in an ongoing footing from their own security efforts. When you have an assessment, we want to see it. We want an out brief on it. We want to see how much testing you're doing. And not just an overview. We'd like to know what you tested and how that marries up with your risk assessment program. Yeah. Why did you test what you tested? Don't just show us the neatest room in the house. Show us, the ugliest, that you have and what's being done about it.
Yeah. When you're picking a babysitter, you just don't say, oh, what's your rate? And then, okay, yeah, come and stay here with my kids for 5 hours. You do your due diligence and you are trusting your data baby, which is really the lifeblood of probably your company, over to a third party. So take your time and it's okay to push back. Now, what do you think about, unfortunately we hear on these panels, you and I are both on panels all the time. Well, people say I have cyber risk insurance, so I'm okay. So what's the risk of this third party risk versus cyber risk insurance? How does that all play into the new ecosystem? Have you heard anything about that?
I have a few thoughts about it. I think originally when cyber risk underwriting started to roll out in the U.S. at least, the problem was the lack of actuarial data.
Right.
There really wasn't a way for the provider to understand what the risk could be, based on lots of substantive data. And to be fair, there was a need to really look at what was covered and under what circumstances things were covered and weren't covered. Notwithstanding those cautionary notes historically, there's a lot more experience, unfortunately, because victims provide experience.
That's right.
And we've had tremendous numbers of victimizations.
Right.
Now we're at a point where cyber risk transference is really quite normal. And to be fair, one of the things to really think about besides the T's and the C's, in any policy would be looking at what comes with it. Does the insurer bring to me a certain capacity in terms of incident response or assessment or security test and evaluation? Does any of that stuff actually come kind of bundled with the actual underwriting in a way that protects the insurer's revenues as well as your own risk factor? So it's rare that you find people that aren't talking about insurance. And to be fair, I've been involved in incident responses where the insurers made what we had to do quite easier, quite a bit easier.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you get a good insurer, then it's going to be priceless.
So I do think it's essential. I think the government, in the public safety sense, the government side of this discussion is more of a municipal discussion or, a state jurisdictional at that level. The jurisdiction in a broader sense is probably where those kinds of relationships occur in detail. So some of the audience may think that they don't have control over this issue. I would still strongly urge that you're arguing that it be that your risk profile be very transparent to whoever's responsible for obtaining that type of underwriting, and that number two, that you're getting as much out of an insurance engagement as you possibly can in terms of services and support.
Again, have a lawyer read any insurance contract, a cybersecurity lawyer who knows what you're really going to be up against if something does go down, and is this insurance even going to scratch the surface? And I think that's really important. Jim, we could talk for hours and hours. We're at the end of our time. Thank you so much for spending time with me. It's great that we actually got a half an hour to just hang out and talk. And thank you for all the great work you do. And again, for NW3C and the whole team over there for being such great partners to us. Together, we really are making a difference. And we hope to have you back on Cyber Threat Thursday again another time.
Kristin, it was really great to be here. Thank you also for what the Cybercrime Support Network's doing. You've moved the needle quite a bit in a positive direction. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Join us again next Thursday for Cyber Threat Thursday. I'll also be back next Tuesday for Cyber Tip Tuesday. And we appreciate what everybody in the cyber ecosystem is doing to help us all be safer. Take care.